Wind howled against the canopy of the Focke-Wulf FW-190A3. A predator of the skies painted in mottled grays, its radial BMW 801 engine growling with a confidence that had become terrifyingly familiar to Allied pilots. Oberleutnant Armin Faber, a decorated Luftwaffe officer of the 3rd JG Jesu, Richthofen, gripped the stick and scanned the horizon. He believed he was flying over the fringes of German-occupied France. Soon he would descend, wheels down, welcomed by ground crew and comrades. He was wrong. Moments earlier, he had been the hunter. He'd pounced on a lone Spitfire Mach-4 that had been chasing a German reconnaissance aircraft. His burst of 20mm cannon fire had torn into the Spitfire's wing, sending the British pilot bailing into the cold sea below. Triumph surged through his veins. For the Luftwaffe, the FW-190 was the king of aerial combat. Faster in a dive, deadlier in firepower, and unmatched in roll rate. British pilots called it the butcher bird, with grim respect. But in this moment of victory, Faber made his first mistake. He fixated on the falling enemy, following the spin too long, losing orientation as he spiraled downward. The blue-gray surface of the channel stretched endlessly below. A perfect mirror that swallowed depth and distance. It was a killer of bearings. To Faber, it looked like safety, like home. He turned southwest. What he believed was toward France. Instead, he was flying deeper into British airspace, 30 miles away, at RAF Pembrey in Wales. The afternoon sun glinted off dispersal pads and fuel bowsers. Ground crews lounged by steel mesh revetments after a tense morning scramble. The war felt distant for the first time that day. Flight Sergeant Jeffrey "Jimmy" James was heading back from the mess when he heard a sound overhead. A sound that didn't belong. A deep-throated radial engine, not the sleek purr of a Merlin. He looked up, squinting. The silhouette cut across the sky with a distinctive, wide-set stance. Not a Spitfire. Definitely not a Hurricane. It was a 190. For a moment, no one reacted. A German fighter? Here? Alone? If it were attacking, it would already be diving. The FW-190 circled the field once, gear dropping like a carrion bird preparing to land. Its yellow theater markings were unmistakable, even in the glare. Jimmy James dropped his mess tin and sprinted toward the nearest parked fighter. Above, in the cockpit, Faber exhaled, relief washing over him. He had found an airfield. The runway was aligned just like those across northern France. The layout felt familiar. Yes, this was surely Vannes or Lannion. Ground victory officers would be eager to debrief him. He lined up his approach. Touchdown. His wheels squealed against the runway. Dust kicked up. The engine growled down to idle. He rolled to a stop, alone on the tarmac. Still nothing. Still silence. Then he heard it. A distant shout. Another. Boots pounding against concrete. Faber sat taller in his seat, expecting the greeting of Luftwaffe mechanics. Instead, he saw shapes emerge from a blast shelter. Uniforms in RAF blue, not Luftwaffe gray. A chill stabbed down his spine. Jimmy James and a fellow airman raced toward the fighter. They didn't have rifles. They didn't have a plan. But neither did they have time for one. The German pilot was already trying to climb out of the cockpit. "Stop!" James shouted, unsure what else to yell. The command instinctive. His voice cracked. Faber froze. His world collapsed into a brutal, undeniable truth. He wasn't in France. He wasn't among friends. He had just delivered Germany's most advanced fighter, completely intact, straight into enemy hands. The pilot's shoulders slumped. He raised his hands slowly. James, still breathless, grabbed the German by the flight jacket and tugged him down, pointing him toward the guard shack. "Move," he barked. Only then did he realize how surreal this was, how monumental. They had captured a live Focke-Wulf 190, the butcher bird itself. Word spread like electricity along the perimeter. Officers sprinted from the operations building. The station commander demanded answers. Guards armed up and encircled the fighter as if it might sprout wings and escape again. Technicians approached with awe and apprehension. Up close, the 190 was solid, powerful, a machine built for dominance. Its wide-track landing gear, its thick wings, its compact, snarling engine. This was the beast that had been gutting their squadrons over France. No bullet holes, no crash damage, a perfect specimen. It took minutes for intelligence officers to cable London. It took seconds for the RAF mechanics to begin circling like hungry scientists confronted with a miracle. Faber was escorted away in stunned silence, his mind reeling. He had trained for aerial duels, not this. How could a few degrees of compass error, a moment of lost horizon, rewrite the fate of a war? He didn't have the answer. But the RAF would soon find it. The trophy sat gleaming under the Welsh sun, and every pilot who had ever lost a friend to a Focke-Wulf wanted to know its secrets. And one man, more than any other, was ready to climb into its cockpit. Captain Eric Winkle Brown had just received the most important aircraft of his career. June 24, 1942, RAF Pembrey, Wales. The morning light had barely lifted the haze off the Irish Sea when Captain Eric Winkle Brown arrived by courier flight. Boots touching the same runway where Armin Faber had made his catastrophic landing just hours earlier. Brown, a Royal Navy test pilot on loan to the RAF, stepped out and immediately locked eyes on the machine that had terrified Allied fighter groups since its first appearances above the Channel the previous autumn. The Focke-Wulf 190A-3. The butcher bird, Germany's prize. Brown approached slowly, as if studying a predator that might still be dangerous even in captivity. He had flown dozens of German aircraft before the war, at air shows and competitions, but never anything like this. The design philosophy radiated brutality. A short, rugged nose housing a massive BMW 801 radial engine, broad wings that looked carved for violent aerobatics, and those wide landing legs, a key advantage for rough frontline strips. British ground crews, armed and cautious, kept a tight perimeter. But their eyes betrayed something else: reverence. For months, Spitfire pilots had returned from France shaking, describing a foe that outclimbed, outrolled, and outgunned them. When the 190 dove away, nothing caught it. Now the mystery was parked on British concrete, and Brown was the man chosen to solve it. He ran a gloved hand along the fuselage. "So this," he murmured, "is what's been killing us." The crew chief stared at the engine cowling. "Sir, that thing is built like a bloody tank," Brown nodded, "and fast enough not to need the armor." Preparing for the first Allied flight, the captured aircraft was rapidly transported to RAF Farnborough, the heart of Britain's aircraft evaluation program. Intelligence officers swarmed it like surgeons around a critical patient. Photographers documented every angle. Engineers traced wiring, disassembled panels, and studied control rods. Every bolt was a clue. Faber's maps and flight logs, confiscated from the cockpit, were whisked away to code breakers. His personal sidearm, a standard-issue Walther PPK, sat locked in evidence. But his biggest weapon was still the machine he had flown across enemy lines. Brown stood beside the aircraft on June 28, 1942, preparing for its maiden Allied flight. He tugged his leather helmet tight, adjusting the chin strap. Several officers gathered behind the rope line, tense. Nobody truly knew what secrets hid within this fighter. Could there be a booby trap? A hidden failure mode? A surprise none of them were ready for? "Remember, Eric," one engineer said, voice thin, "we'd very much like the aircraft to remain in one piece." Brown flashed a smirk. "I'll return it in better shape than the Germans gave it to us." The ladder clanged lightly as he climbed. The cockpit was cramped, built for a smaller German frame. But everything felt deliberately engineered. No wasted switches, a thick, armored glass windscreen, a seat designed to protect from a 20mm round fired from behind. This airplane was built for survival in a knife fight. Brown primed the engine. The propeller jerked, spun, then the BMW radial thundered to life. A chest-shaking roar that seemed too powerful for the airframe. The concrete vibrated beneath the wheels. A hush fell across the crowd. Then the Butcher Bird rolled forward. Into enemy wings, Brown eased the throttle open. The aircraft accelerated with startling authority. None of the Spitfire's graceful hesitation. At 120 mph, he tapped back on the stick. The 190 leapt skyward. He climbed sharply, adrenaline rising as Farnborough shrank beneath him. He tested the stick left. The wings snapped into a roll so fast, he nearly slammed his head against the canopy frame. Jesus. He centered the controls, breathing out a laugh. So that's how they do it. Over the next 20 minutes, he mapped the aircraft's soul. Roll rate, like nothing he'd flown, a blur of motion. Dive acceleration, terrifying. The nose dropped and speed surged instantly. Firepower, 4 cannons and 2 machine guns, overwhelming compared to a Spitfire. Energy retention, it refused to slow down in maneuvers. Visibility, excellent forward, decent all around. Another edge in combat. Every turn, every climb, every dive answered a question that had been killing pilots for months. This was why so many Spitfires never came home. This machine didn't fight like a Predator. It was the Predator. Brown later wrote, "The 190 was a brilliant fighter. In certain areas, it outclassed the Spitfire entirely." Back at Farnborough, he landed to a swarm of shouting scribes and engineers thrusting clipboards forward. "What's the verdict?" one demanded. Brown pushed his goggles up, eyes glinting. "We finally know what we're up against." But he wasn't finished. "For everything this aircraft can do," he added, "there's one thing it does poorly, and that may be how we kill it." The officers leaned in, because in those final minutes of the flight, Brown had discovered what no Allied pilot had yet lived long enough to report. The Butcher Bird had a blind side, a flaw, a fatal one, and now the RAF, and soon the Americans, were going to exploit it. July 1942, RAF Farnborough, England. The captured FW-190 sat gleaming inside a hangar that was now guarded night and day. Even the Prime Minister had been informed. Churchill reportedly grinned when he heard, "So the Hun has given us their finest plaything. Let's see what we can learn." Captain Eric Brown wasted no time. Flight after flight, he pushed the aircraft to its limits, mapping its behavior at every edge of performance. Engineers recorded every observation. Intelligence officers crafted combat reports to circulate among frontline squadrons. The Allies weren't just curious anymore. They were desperate. For 8 months, the FW-190 had been butchering Spitfire Menk V squadrons over northern France. RAF losses weren't just numbers, they were friends. Names. Empty bunks in the mess hall. Brown knew that what he found inside this German machine could save those lives. The discovery. It wasn't the thrill of speed or maneuvering that led Brown to the 190's fatal vulnerability. It was the climb. At first, everything about the aircraft's performance seemed superior. In a dive, it pulled away like a hawk chasing fleeing prey. Its roll rate, the ability to flip from one wing to another, was so violent that Brown joked a pilot could tie his own neck in a knot if he wasn't careful. Firepower? Devastating. And its armor and structure made it sturdy, forgiving, and lethal in rough-and-tumble combat. But during sustained climbs, steep, nose-up angles, Brown felt the engine gasp. The BMW 801's cooling system struggled. Oil temperatures spiked dangerously. Brown tried a sustained vertical pull. The engine shuddered, sputtered, nearly quit. He leveled out quickly, heart pounding. There it was. The Luftwaffe had built the perfect low-altitude brawler, but one that choked in the vertical. The British test team stared at his report. Exploit the climb. Force the 190 upward. Attack from above. It was the opposite of what most RAF pilots were attempting. They'd been trying to turn with the Focke-Wulf, a death sentence. Now, the recipe for victory was becoming clear. A tactical revolution. Over the next weeks, intelligence teams rushed Brown's findings to every active fighter group. At briefing huts from Biggin Hill to Manston, pilots gathered around chalkboards scrawled with 3 new orders. 1. Don't dogfight the F-1190 in a turn. You will lose. 2. Climb aggressively. Make him overheat. 3. Stay above. Bounce the Focke-Wulf. Never chase it downward. Briefings shifted tone. This wasn't fear anymore. It was understanding. If a pilot knew his enemy's weakness, he entered the fight with power. Squadrons built vertical attack doctrine into their training. The trick was to hit first, hit hard, and then climb away, forcing the 190 pilot to either dive and flee, or follow upward into death. Sometimes, knowledge is the deadliest weapon of all. The human cost behind the numbers. The briefings were clinical. FW-190 blind spot here. Attack vector there. But Brown and the other analysts understood what this meant on the ground. Letters might stop arriving at fewer British doorsteps. Mothers might stop losing sons. Pilots might finally feel they had a fighting chance. Every diagram drawn from Brown's reports had a silent message. This is how your friend could have survived. That weight wasn't lost on anyone in the room. The Americans enter the arena. Across the Atlantic, the United States was gearing up for its entrance into the European Air War. The P-38s and P-47s were about to begin escort missions with the 8th Air Force. American pilots were new to Luftwaffe cunning, but they were hungry, and they needed every scrap of intelligence they could get. Brown's analysis, from dive curves to roll limits, was translated, copied, and shipped straight into American hands. In a classroom in East Anglia, a young U.S. pilot named Lieutenant Jack Reynolds stared at the silhouette of the 190 on a projector screen. Beside him, other fresh-faced flyers whispered anxiously. The instructor tapped the aircraft's nose with a wooden pointer. This bastard here is killing Spitfires, and if you're not careful, he'll kill you too. But thanks to some German fellow who couldn't read his compass, we now know how to beat him. Laughter rippled, nervous but real. Reynolds took notes with shaking fingers, underlining one phrase again and again. Climb, force him up, hit from above. Those words would later save his life over Bremen. Inside the mind of a captured pilot. Meanwhile, Armin Faber sat behind barbed wire at an interrogation center in Trent Park. Officers treated him well. Tea, cigarettes, polite conversation. They didn't need torture. They already had what mattered: his aircraft. Still, they hoped he might shed psychological light. "Why did you land in Wales?" one interrogator asked. Faber stared at the table, unable to meet the officer's gaze. "I believed it was France," he whispered. "I was following the coastline, the channel. It plays tricks." He didn't speak of the shame that kept him awake each night. He didn't need to. Everyone in the room understood. A single pilot had handed the Allies the keys to Germany's most dangerous aircraft. The interrogator leaned forward. "You've changed the war, Oberleutnant," he said quietly. Faber closed his eyes. He knew it was true. Strategic shift in the skies. Soon, Allied combat reports changed tone. Knut's FW-190 disengaged due to overheating. Enemy refused climb, dove away. Bounce successful, no casualties, Pilots who once feared the butcher bird now saw it as a puzzle with a solution. Not an unbeatable monster, not a phantom of death, just a machine with limits. And that shift, inside the minds of Allied flyers, was one of the most powerful victories of the war. Because every great weapon becomes less frightening once you understand how to kill it. The butcher bird had ruled the skies, but now the hunters were learning where to aim, and soon the Allies would not just counter the 190, they would surpass it. August 1942, Supermarine Experimental Flight, RAF Boscombe Down. In a hangar brimming with blueprints and the smell of hot oil, Chief Designer Joseph "Joe" Smith, successor to the legendary R.J. Mitchell, paced in front of a stripped-down Spitfire MK-V. Engineers studied FW-190 photographs pinned to corkboards, like detectives stalking a killer. And in a way, they were. The FW-190 had exposed a brutal truth. The Spitfire MK-V, once Europe's champion, was now outclassed. Pilots felt it first. Technology confirmed it later. The RAF needed a faster, stronger, meaner Spitfire. Smith slammed his fist against the metal cowling of a prototype. "We can't wait for the perfect design," he growled. "We need a fix right bloody now." The question wasn't whether the Spitfire could be improved. The question was whether they could do it fast enough to stop the bleeding. Operation: Give the Spitfire claws. Brown's evaluation of the FW-190 provided not just tactics, but engineering targets. His findings became marching orders. Match or exceed the 190's role at medium altitudes. Improve acceleration in level flight. Increase climb capability without overheating. Upgrade firepower to compete with the 190's cannons. Boost pilot visibility and ruggedness. Supermarine engineers swarmed prototypes, replacing engines, shortening wings, adjusting radiators. Every bolt turned was a response to a pilot who had died in French skies. The answer arrived in the form of a new heart for the Spitfire. Rolls-Royce Merlin 61 two-stage supercharger. Performance at high altitude. The transformation was profound. The Spitfire MK-V had been fighting on the wrong battlefield. The new version would own the one the 190 couldn't touch. The high sky. A new predator, the Spitfire MK-9. The upgraded airframe emerged under a hastily drawn designation. Spitfire MK-9. It wasn't sleek and refined like a clean sheet design. It was a Frankenstein of war, a stopgap, but a brilliant one. Everything about it screamed counterpunch. Martial, more horsepower, Basu's brutal climb. High-altitude supercharger. Performance where 190 engine choked. 4-cannon dual 303 layout. A return to lethal parity. Cleaner cowling. And faster acceleration. Pilots took one look and grinned like wolves who had found their teeth again. Revenge in the Skies, July 1942, Biggin Hill. Wing Commander Al Deer, veteran of the Battle of Britain, briefed his men beneath a chalk sketch of a 190. "Gentlemen, today we take the fight back to them." MK-9s roared skyward in formation, climbing with purpose. Over Dieppe, the familiar shapes appeared. FW-190s, swooping in like hawks to feast. Only this time, the hawks misjudged their prey. As a German ace dove, expecting the Spitfires to flounder below, one MK-9 snapped into a near vertical climb and kept climbing. A moment of disbelief, then panic. The German engine sputtered. The Spitfire did not. In an instant, roles reversed. A Spitfire latched onto the 190's belly, the very blind spot Brown had discovered. 4 Hispano cannons opened up. Shells ripped through aluminum. The Focke-Wulf spiraled down in flames. A British pilot shouted into his radio, "The butcher bird bleeds." Across the channel, more 190s were forced into defensive dives, the only escape they had left. But now the Spitfires owned the top of the sky. They could dive just as easily. The hunted had become the hunter. Hitler's eagles feel the pressure. Inside Luftwaffe command posts in France, camouflage nets draped over timber bunkers couldn't protect morale from cracking. Situational reports became frantic. Spitfires outperforming at altitude. Loss ratios increasing. F-190 advantages eroding. Pilots who once toyed with the enemy suddenly found themselves fighting for their own survival. In one grim mess hall, a German squadron leader folded a telegram and whispered, "The Allies have learned our secret. The Americans take flight." By autumn, the U.S. 8th Air Force joined the high-altitude battle. P-47 Thunderbolts, armed with Brown's tactical insights, flew escort with a new confidence. Don't turn with the 190. Dive after him, or climb and force him to cook his engine. Lieutenant Jack Reynolds, the same young American from training, stared down at his first real dogfight over Bremen. A 190 flashed past. Instinct screamed, "Chase him down." Training whispered, "No, up." Reynolds pulled into a climb. The German followed, and immediately regretted it. White smoke puffed from the 190's engine as temperatures spiked. The German rolled, desperate to escape. Too late. Jack's 50 cals stitched through the right wing. The butcher bird's feathers caught fire. Reynolds exhaled, alive because of a German pilot's navigational sin months earlier. A sudden, stunning shift. RAF intelligence charts showed the reversal in stark, bloody lines. The 190 kills, declining Allied pilot survivability. The Hanapanyuan is rising. Morale soared. Confidence returned. Fear, once a shadow on every briefing room wall, evaporated. Pilots began writing home again with hope in their words. One letter from a Spitfire ace read, "Tell Mum I'm not afraid of the 190 anymore." That single sentence was a victory greater than statistics. A war made from moments. It was astonishing, really. How war could pivot on something so small. A wrong turn, a misread coastline, a single landing in the wrong country. Armin Faber didn't fire a shot after that mistake, and yet he handed over the Luftwaffe's secret weapon. He exposed its limits. He triggered a new Allied fighter revolution. He saved pilots he would never meet. History doesn't always hinge on heroic deeds. Sometimes it hinges on human error, and this error was about to echo even louder. Because now that the Allies had matched the FW-190, they were preparing to surpass it. October 1942. Duxford Airfield, Cambridgeshire. The fog lifted slowly across the runways as a new sound rolled over the countryside. The thunder of double Wasp engines. The United States Army Air Forces had arrived in force. A wave of P-47 Thunderbolts, massive, muscular fighters, taxied into their dispersal bays like steel bison. For many of these young American pilots, this was their first time on foreign soil. They were strangers in a war that had already consumed the skies for years. And the stories they'd heard from RAF comrades were grim. To watch for the FW-190. If he's above you, he owns you. But now, those men sat in crowded briefing rooms, eyes lifted to slides displaying silhouettes of the Focke-Wulf's wings, its cooling vents, and its canopy frame angles. British officers stepped aside as an instructor. Major Bill Iron Gut Daniels pointed to a highlighted zone beneath the aircraft. "This is his blind spot. If you're here, he can't see you. He can't aim his cannons, and he's already halfway dead." Lieutenant Jack Reynolds, sweating despite the cold, tapped the notes in his lap. He remembered the line circled 3 times. "Climb, force him up, hit from above." That directive came from one man's relentless test flights in a captured plane. A name these pilots now spoke almost reverently. Captain Eric Brown. The first trial by fire, January 21st, 1943. Over the North Sea. Barely weeks after arriving, the Americans were thrown into their first major engagement defending a B-17 bomber wing returning from Wilhelmshaven. Lieutenant Reynolds' headset crackled. "Bandits, 10 o'clock high, Focke-Wulfs." Dark shapes exploded down from altitude. A textbook German bounce attack. The Americans were caught low, the exact scenario Brown had warned them about. Reynolds clutched his stick, adrenaline surging. The bombers took hits. Engines flamed. Crews bailed out in tiny, tumbling specks against the midday sun. "Don't dive after them," Daniels barked over the radio. "Climb, damn it, climb!" Reynolds hauled the nose up. G-forces pressed him deep into the seat. The engine howled. The Thunderbolt roared higher and higher. A 190 slid into view above him, but kept diving. The German expected the Americans to pursue downward like prey. Not today. Reynolds reached the top of his climb and rolled clean over. Suddenly, he was the one above. He was in the blind spot. Trigger down. 50 cowl tracers stitched across the FW-190's fuselage. The German pilot never saw it coming. Flame bloomed from the cowling. Reynolds let out a sharp, gasping laugh. His hands shook. He was still alive. Lessons paid in blood. The victory was not without cost. Other Thunderbolt pilots, unable to resist instinct, dove after fleeing Germans, straight into trap patterns that the Luftwaffe had perfected. 2 P-47s vanished in spiraling smoke. A third limped home with a wing shredded. The Americans learned something that stuck with every survivor. The first rule of fighting the FU-190 is humility. The second rule is altitude. It was a harsh baptism, but a necessary one. Enter the fork-tailed devil. By spring, another American Predator joined the fight. The P-38 Lightning. Twin engines, long range, a fighter designed for hunting and surviving. Luftwaffe pilots initially underestimated the unusual twin-boom aircraft. That changed fast. March 14, 1943, over Abbeville. A formation of lightning struck a patrolling FW-190 squadron from above. No warning, no chance. In less than 60 seconds, 3 butcher birds were falling in pieces. German radio calls were frantic. Achtung, the twin tail climbs like a rocket. And once again, a captured aircraft's weakness, heat under climb, was the difference between predator and prey. Why Brown's work saved lives. Every after-action report across the 8th Air Force reinforced Brown's findings. When we climb, we survive. When we dive after them, we die. Hit once, disengage, never linger. If he dives, let him go. What began as intelligence became instinct, and instinct is what keeps a pilot alive when seconds decide everything. The Germans feel the shift. In Luftwaffe outposts along the French coast, a new fear crept into ready rooms. The Americans were no longer novices. They were students, and deadly ones. A German ace, Oberfeldwebel Kurt Wenzel, slammed a map onto a briefing table. The Yankees don't follow anymore. They climb. They strike from high. They are using our own weakness against us. Frustration simmered into anger. Anger chilled into fear. And fear kills just as effectively as bullets. The war of information. This wasn't merely a war of steel and fuel. It was a war of knowledge. One pilot's mistake, a simple moment of confusion over water, had shifted the intelligence balance of Europe. The Allies didn't just have the FW-190's specs. They had its limitations, its behavior, its soul. And the Americans were now flying with a confidence the Luftwaffe hadn't seen since 1940. As bomber formations lengthened, missions deepened into Germany, and escorts grew bolder. The butcher birds found themselves suddenly on the defensive. The sky no longer belonged to the Reich, but the Allies were not done learning. Because the FW-190 held another secret, one no engineer had expected, and it was buried deep beneath the airframe's skin, something the British were about to uncover. And that discovery wouldn't just improve Allied tactics. It would reshape fighter design for the rest of the war. Early August 1942, RAF Duxford. Captain Eric Brown stepped out of the cockpit of the freshly overhauled Focke-Wulf 190. His flying suit darkened by sweat and his mind still racing with revelations. The debriefing room filled with engineers, air intelligence officers, and squadron leaders hungry for answers. Answers British and American pilots desperately needed. Brown pulled down the blind on a projection board and tapped the chalk against it. "Gentlemen," he said calmly, though his voice carried the weight of men's lives, "we now know how the butcher's bill is being written." He drew a line in the shape of a wing cross-section, thicker at the root, sweeping cleverly into a broad chord. German engineering had sculpted a wing strong enough to twist under load without breaking, allowing the FW-190 to roll like nothing Allied pilots had ever faced. Brown had just demonstrated that brutally, snapping the aircraft from left bank to right in a heartbeat. "When a Spitfire engages," he said, "the Focke-Wulf will simply roll out of your gun sights and dive away. You will not catch it in a dive." The room shifted uneasily. They'd known it in blood, but now they heard it in words. But Brown wasn't finished. He walked to the table and lifted a small model representing a Spitfire Mark 9, Britain's newest answer to the German menace. You won't beat it by chasing its strengths. You must exploit its weaknesses. He tapped the model's nose. The 190's engine overheats in sustained climbs. Its roll rate collapses at altitude, and visibility over the nose during landing or steep turns, appalling. He sketched a vertical zoom climb. If forced up high and denied room to dive, the 190 stumbles. Spitfire wings keep their stiffness. The German wings? They flutter. The intelligence officers exchanged looks. This wasn't just information. It was a counterplay. Brown leaned in, voice lower. "And if you turn into it, hard, especially at low altitude, the Focke-Wulf may win the roll. But we win the turn." The tactics began writing themselves. Don't chase the dive. Force the climb. Fight high. Turn in. Hit him where he can't twist away. The briefing ended. Papers gathered. Boots scraped the concrete floor. Outside, engines barked to life. The war in the air was changing. 2 weeks later, RAF No. 64 Squadron, English Channel Patrol. Flying officer Arthur Kershaw tightened his harness as the scrambled Spitfires knifed through broken clouds. Chatter crackled over the radio. "Bandits, 10 o'clock low." Kershaw's stomach tensed. His brother had gone down over Dieppe, victim of a 190 swooping out of nowhere, rolling out of every gun pass. The memory hit like a cold punch. But today, they had a new playbook. 2 dark specks grew into 4, sleek radial engine killers, sunlight flaring on their canopies. "Remember the brief," Squadron Leader Barnes barked. As the 190s dove toward them, a tactic that once guaranteed terror, Barnes snapped his Spitfire upward, not down. German pilots expected prey to flee. Instead, the British fighters shoved into vertical climbs, forcing the Germans to follow where their engines would run hot and their wings lose authority. Kershaw felt the Spitfire strain, wings humming. A 190 surged past him, failed to snap into a quick roll, and overshot, vulnerable. Kershaw caught the flash of the black iron cross in his sights. Fire. Cannon shells stitched across the 190's wing route. Smoke burst. The once invincible Predator spiraled down into the sea. Kershaw's shout of triumph echoed in his headset. The myth of the unstoppable Focke-Wulf had just cracked. Across the Atlantic East Coast, USA, 56th Fighter Group Training Grounds, Captain Francis Gabi Gabreski, a Polish-American ace in the making, stood beside his brand-new P-47 Thunderbolt, a monster of aluminum and firepower. Beside him, an RAF liaison officer laid down the new doctrine. Don't try to roll with them. Force vertical fights. Use your dive only when you choose. And for God's sake, never chase a 190 downward into France. American pilots listened, jaws set. The Thunderbolt was faster in a dive, but they learned from Brown's test flights that speed wasn't enough without tactics to control the fight. Gabreski slapped his P-47's thick fuselage. "We'll take the fight to them," he muttered. but on our terms. He didn't know it yet. But he would become one of America's deadliest aces, using those very lessons to tear into Luftwaffe formations over Europe. Autumn 1942. Somewhere over Caen, France, German ace Oberfeldwebel Karl-Heinz Maurer pushed his FW-190 into a steep dive, his escape move perfected over months of victories. But the Spitfires behind him did not follow. They climbed instead. Maurer tried to pivot into a roll, his signature move. But at 16,000 feet, the 190 shuddered. The roll that once felt like flicking a wrist became sluggish. Panicked, the British fighters swooped down from above. Hawks out of the sun. Maurer swore. How had they learned? Tracer fire slashed his right wing. Warning lights screamed. He punched out just before the canopy lit with flame. Below his parachute, the battlefield spun. A world changed by a single pilot's mistake. By winter, the proof was undeniable. RAF losses fell. Air battles evened. The USAAF entered Europe not blind, but armed with insight wrung from German engineering. Pilots who once feared the butcher bird, as the FW-190 was grimly nicknamed, now studied how to clip its wings. The Luftwaffe began to feel something new: pressure, doubt, and a sense that the hunter was becoming the hunted. But the Allies had only just begun to truly exploit what Captain Eric Brown had discovered. Because the captured 190 had one more secret, one that would turn the skies of Europe into a battleground, Germany could no longer dominate. January 1943, RAF Farnborough, Air Fighting Development Unit. The hangar air hung cold and sharp, but inside, the energy was electric. Engineers hunched over the captured FW-190A3, panels removed, guts exposed. The Allies had already wrung tactical knowledge from the machine, but now they wanted something deeper. How to build a better Predator than the Predator itself. Captain Eric Brown stood beside USALF Colonel Harold Red Muller, who had arrived expressly to examine the German marvel. Brown pointed at the BMW 801 radial engine's intricate cooling system, where cowl vents and louvers responded automatically to temperature demands. A remarkable machine, Muller admitted, running a gloved hand over the cowling. No wonder our boys have been getting chewed up. Brown nodded. The Spitfire Mark IX had closed the gap, but parity was not victory. And America, preparing for a massive daylight bombing campaign over Germany, needed a fighter that could fight deep and escort home. Mueller tapped the schematic rolled out before them. "So, we take what's best about this thing," he murmured. "And we build something meaner." Brown smiled faintly. "That's the idea." New York City, Republic Aviation Headquarters. February 1943. Alexander Kartveli, lead designer of the P-47 Thunderbolt, stood in his office staring at photographs of the stripped German fighter. He didn't need translation to understand what he was seeing. Thicker armor, deadly cannons, high-speed roll authority, pilot survivability. Kartveli slapped the photos down and spun to his drafting team. "They didn't build it light," he growled. "They built it to win." The Thunderbolt was already a powerhouse. But now, Republic engineers moved to incorporate lessons from the FW-190. Bubble canopy for all-angle visibility, improved high-speed aileron control, optimized gun harmonization for short, brutal bursts. No more graceful dueling. This would be aerial brawling. Production orders escalated. The skies would never look the same. Meanwhile, Germany. Adolf Galland, chief of Luftwaffe Fighter Command, sat stiffly in a Berlin war room, a half-smoked cigarette trembling between his fingers. Reports lay scattered before him, pages soaked in dread. FW-190 losses rising. Spitfire minute effectiveness, increasing P-47 units entering the fray. Bomber escorts learning the trick of altitude combat. Galland slammed his fist down. How did they learn so quickly? Silence. Not one staff officer dared to speak the truth aloud. Because one of their own pilots had delivered mastery into enemy hands. Though Galland still praised the 190 as the Luftwaffe's best dogfighter, he sensed the shift. The Allies weren't merely catching up, they were evolving. May 1943, USAF, 56th Fighter Group, England. Captain Gabby Gabreski yanked his P-47 into a steep climbing turn over the channel. Sweat stung his eyes. Two FW-190s cut in from above, guns belching fire. Old tactics would have meant certain death. But Gabreski had studied Brown's reports. He knew what to do. Rather than snap roll away, he pitched up hard, straight into the vertical. His Thunderbolt bellowed, supercharger howling. The nearest 190 tried to follow, its engine straining, airflow biting the wings with a warning buffet. Gabreski's P-47 kept climbing. Now he had the sun at his back. He rolled over and dove onto the German with murderous speed. Tracers sliced through the 190's fuselage, fuel venting, flames licking the tail. The crippled fighter plunged toward the sea. Gabreski hissed between clenched teeth. That's for the boys you murdered last year. But even as victory tasted sweet, he knew the war wasn't won. Not yet. Germany strikes back. The FW-190 evolves. By mid-1943, German engineers specializing in aerodynamics and fighter design recognized the urgent need to regain dominance. Their answer was the FW-190D9, featuring a longer nose housing a liquid-cooled Jumo 213 engine, improved high-altitude performance, faster climb, and tighter turns. Pilots nicknamed it the Long-Nose Dora. This was no longer the butcher bird Allies had learned to tame. This was a new predator, designed to hunt the American B-17s, smashing Germany's factories by day. The arms race in the skies had entered a new phase. June 1943. Above Schweinfurt, B-17 defensive gunners scanned the horizon as a fresh wave of fighters approached. Sleek, longer, faster, Sergeant Tom Weller shouted into the intercom. That's not the 190 we know. A Dora slashed through the formation in a blaze of cannon fire. A flying fortress spiraled down, trailing smoke. The USAIF was shocked. Their advantage, so swiftly built, had been shoved back into question. The voice of Group Command crackled in headsets. We adapt, or we die up here. Yet even as Germany fielded its next evolution, too much had already been lost. The Allies knew the FW-190 inside and out, anticipated new variants, had aircraft in production to counter them, spread new tactics across every squadron. Germany could innovate. But now they reacted instead of dictating the battle. And worse, they were losing the experienced pilots needed to fly these machines. What began with Armin Faber's landing at Pembrey had rippled outward until the entire Luftwaffe was fighting uphill. Every skirmish haunted by knowledge the Allies should never have possessed. The tide had turned, but fate had one more twist left. One more revelation waiting inside the captured fighter that would push America to build a weapon unlike anything seen before. A machine that would take the fight into Germany's heart and break its spirit in the air. July 1943, Lockheed Aircraft Corporation, Burbank, California. A team of engineers and officers huddled around a chalkboard marked with aggressive angles and airflow diagrams, concept art for a new American escort fighter. The mood was tense, driven by a single urgent question. How do we take daylight air superiority and make it permanent? Major Thomas "Tommy" Johnson from the USAAF tapped the blueprint of the latest prototype's wing. This is what we learned from that damned Focke-Wulf, he said. Low drag, high speed, incredible roll at combat altitudes. Across from him, Lockheed's chief designer Kelly Johnson nodded. His mind worked like a gun sight, precise, deadly, focused. We're not building to match the 190, he growled. We're building something it can't survive. The Americans had studied the German fighter's greatest strength, its domination at medium altitude, and engineered a brutal answer, a long-range, high-altitude killer. Its name, P-38 Lightning. Twin engines, razor nose, cannon that spat explosive shells in a single, concentrated stream. But the lightning was only the beginning. 2,000 miles away, another design, the true inheritor of the FW-190's lessons, was emerging. North American Aviation. Inglewood, California, September 1943. Test pilot Bob Chilton eased a new prototype down the runway, sunlight flashing across a slick aluminum skin. This fighter combined everything Germany taught the Allies: aerodynamic efficiency, massive firepower, roll authority at deadly speeds, pilot visibility through a new bubble canopy. It fired Brown's insight straight back at the Luftwaffe. Chilton pushed the throttle forward. The aircraft leapt into the sky, smooth, hungry, unstoppable. Engineers cheered as it sliced through the blue. The name stamped on the fresh paint: P-51 Mustang. Across the Atlantic, the war over. Germany intensifies. December 1940, Bremen. Thunderclouds of flak exploded around a B-17 formation as they punched toward the target. Defensive guns barked fire into the darkness, but every gunner feared the same brutal silhouette: the long-nosed FW-190 Dora. Enemy fighters, 2 o'clock high. The call came too late for one fortress. Cannon bursts shredded its wing, sending the bomber tumbling in flames. But then, a new sound, a howl like a diving hawk. Mustangs dove out of the sun, contrails ripping the sky open. Their speed shocked the Germans. Their aim was perfect. A Dora caught a burst, wings ripped apart like paper. The pilot ejected too low, parachute never opened. One FW-190 down, then another. It was the first time the Luftwaffe felt hunted over their own homeland. At a Luftwaffe airfield outside Hanover, the German struggle grows desperate. Oberst Walter Dahl slammed his fist against the fuselage of his grounded Dora. They have our secrets. They fly our tactics. His ground crew avoided his glare. They all knew the truth. The Luftwaffe was burning through fuel, aircraft, pilots, while the Allies only grew stronger. The Dora was brilliant, but surrounded, outnumbered, outpaced. Dahl stared up at the sky, where contrails wove a new hierarchy of power. "The Americans have learned too much," he muttered, "and we taught them." RAF debriefing room, England early, 1944. Captain Eric Brown stood before yet another group of young pilots. American, British, Canadian, fresh faces eager for vengeance, terrified of failure. He tapped the board where he had drawn the German fighter almost 2 years prior. "This enemy is no longer invincible," he told them, "because we were given a gift." He didn't need to explain. Everyone knew the story now. June 23, 1942. A lost pilot, a wrong airfield, a perfect fighter delivered untouched. Brown's voice hardened. The Focke-Wulf 190 killed thousands. Now its knowledge saves thousands more. The pilots absorbed every word. From fear came understanding. From understanding came dominance. From dominance would come victory. Outside, Mustangs warmed up on the tarmac. Propellers spinning into blurs, exhausts chugging smoke into the frigid dawn. Gabreski walked past the line of P-47s preparing for launch. He placed a hand on a wing. Once, his fighter was outclassed. Now it was feared. He smirked. "Let's finish this." The stakes had inverted. Germany's hunter had become prey. The Dora fought on. The butcher bird clawed at the sky with a veteran's fury. Luftwaffe aces bled for every mile of airspace. But the war had forever shifted the day Oberleutnant Armin Faber's wheels touched British soil. By sheer accident, he had unlocked the cage around Germany's best-kept secret. Now the skies belonged to those who learned from the mistake. And the final act of this airborne transformation, of this war shaped by one pilot's navigation error, was just beginning. The Allies had the aircraft. They had the tactics. They had the numbers. Next, they would take the fight directly to the heart of the Reich, until no German fighter remained to challenge the daylight. The air war was entering its decisive storm. February 20th, 1944. Operation Argument. Later called Big Week. The pre-dawn cold at RAF Leiston sliced through leather flight jackets as pilots climbed into their fighters. The order was simple in words, but brutal in meaning. Break the Luftwaffe, in the sky, everywhere. Captain Don Gentile sat inside his P-51B Mustang, fingers tapping anxiously on the throttle as the engine warmed. The plan called for deep strikes against German aircraft factories. Leipzig, Brunswick, Gotha, day after day. And this time, the bombers wouldn't go alone. Mustangs formed up on their wings, silver guardians stretching as far as the eye could see. Gentile could hear the B-17 crews over the radio, voices tight with dread and hope. Glad to have you boys with us today. He smirked behind his oxygen mask. We'll get you home. As the formation crossed into German airspace, contrails tangled above like chalk lines on a slate, the front lines of a new kind of war. The Luftwaffe scrambled desperately. Dozens of FW-190s and Bf-109s streaked in from all angles. The sky ignited. At 25,000 feet, chaos. Tracer fire slashed through formation boxes. A fortress exploded, debris vaporizing into black smoke and fire. Bandits, high 12. Break, break. Keep the tight turn, don't chase. The warnings came too late for some, but for every 190 that dove in claws first, a Mustang was there waiting. Gentile caught sight of a 190 trying to roll out of his line of fire. An old trick. He'd learned the countermeasure from the reports drawn from Faber's captured aircraft. Don't follow the roll, anticipate the dive. Cut him off. He pitched high, then snapped down into a dive ahead of the fleeing German. The 190 pilot looked back and realized he'd just been outthought by his own nation's technology. Gentile's guns hammered. The FW-190 fell burning, the pilot bailing out into a sky he no longer controlled. Gentile whispered, "Thanks for the insight, Faber." Elsewhere in the battle, a German perspective, Lieutenant Matthias Kruger's Dora shuddered under G-forces as he rolled into a defensive dive. His squadron had once owned this sky, dictating every engagement. Now, they were reacting to every move the Americans made. A P-47 thundered past him in a vertical climb. Where once Kruger's roll would have shaken pursuit, now the Allied fighter cut inside with precision that felt impossible. "How do they know?" he barked over the radio. No answer. Only the shriek of cannon fire as another Dora spiraled downward. In his mind, Kruger saw a single moment, June 23, 1942. A landing field. The wrong one. One pilot's mistake now punished every German pilot who took flight. Berlin, Luftwaffe High Command Headquarters. Albert Speer reviewed factory damage reports. Wismar, crippled Gotha. Burning Regensburg, smashed Schweinfurt, crippled again. Hitler slammed his fist on the map table. "This is impossible. Our fighters are the best in the world." Gallen's voice was flat, defeated. They were, until the Allies got one. Silence choked the room. The truth lay unspoken. The Luftwaffe had lost the war the day the FW-190 landed in Wales. Everything since was merely time delaying the inevitable. Spring 1944, above Germany's industrial heartland, Mustangs stretched their range deeper. Thunderbolts prowled below. Lightning slashed the higher air. The Allied mission evolved. Attack any 190 before it could attack a bomber. Destroy aircraft on the ground. Strangle the Luftwaffe at its roots. Gabby Gabreski, now a rising star of the USAIF, led a flight toward an airfield near Hanover. Spotting a line of Doras parked wing to wing, he smiled coldly. "That's a gift." He rolled in low. His 850 cal machine guns roared. German planes erupted in flames, burning, flipping, melting into slag. The Luftwaffe wouldn't even get them off the ground. Planes once feared by every Allied pilot now died without firing a shot. RAF debrief room. Eric Brown watched the intelligence updates with astonishment. The numbers were undeniable. FW-190 kill ratios, collapsing pilot losses, irreplaceable training pipelines shattered, experienced aces dead or grounded. The butcher bird hadn't become less dangerous. The Allies had become unstoppable. Brown allowed himself a rare moment of pride. "Their finest gift," he murmured to a colleague. was showing us how to beat them. He thought of Armin Faber, still alive, still a prisoner in Britain. Did that man understand what he had changed? What countless lives he had saved? What power he had surrendered? The war in the sky shifted from struggle to dominance. By summer 1944, the Luftwaffe could no longer stop the bombers, could no longer dictate the fight, could no longer resurrect the fear the FW-190 once commanded. Mustangs ranged over Berlin. Thunderbolts ruled the low altitudes. Lightnings hunted anything that dared climb too high. The air above the Reich belonged to America and its allies, and Germany could feel the noose tightening. What began with one mistake was now a strategic catastrophe, one that would soon allow the Allies to launch the most decisive invasion in military history. The next chapter of the war wouldn't begin in the air. It would begin on the beaches of France. A new dawn was approaching, and the Luftwaffe would be powerless to stop it. June 6, 1944, D-Day, Normandy, France. The sun rose over the coast, casting a pale glow across thousands of ships crowding the Channel, the greatest invasion force in history. Allied troops stormed toward the beaches under a sky thick with aircraft. P-47 Thunderbolts dove low, smashing German bunkers and convoys. Above them, P-51 Mustangs soared, engines roaring like victory itself. Their job was to keep the Luftwaffe out of the skies, permanently. And they did. Only scattered German fighters dared approach the armada. Among them, FDO-190s, once kings of the Channel, now desperate defenders scrambling from airfields that the Allies would soon overrun. One Luftwaffe commander, scanning the horizon from his bunker, muttered bitterly, "Where is the air cover we were promised?" He already knew the answer. The Luftwaffe had bled out over Germany, whittled down in a war of attrition made possible because Allied pilots understood the FW-190, its strengths, its weaknesses, its soul. Knowledge stolen from fate. Knowledge delivered by one man. Several weeks later, St. Lo, France Captain Don Gentile, now a legend, banked his Mustang over a fleeing convoy. He keyed the radio. "Hit those trucks. No survivors. They're supplying the front." Strafing runs shredded the column, ammunition trucks erupting into jagged fireballs. Gentile pulled up sharply, adrenaline pounding. The skies were quiet here. Too quiet. "The Luftwaffe's finished," he whispered. No reply. Not because the radio was bad, but because there was almost nothing left to fight. Where once FW-190s dove like wolves from the sun, now the sky felt like an open highway. The butcher bird was nearly extinct. September 1944. Oberleutnant Armin Faber sat in a POW camp in Shropshire, staring at a patch of pale autumn sky through the wire fence. He listened each morning as Allied fighter patrols thundered overhead. Mustangs. Always Mustangs. He could pick out the engine note instantly, the confident purr of the Packard-built Merlin. A guard passing by spat on the ground and muttered, "Hell of a thing you gave us, Fritz." Faber looked away, cheeks flushed with shame. He replayed that day again and again. The chase over the Channel, the excitement, the confusion, thinking the airfield below was German waving to the ground crew, and then seeing the Spitfires parked nearby, realizing the truth too late. His mistake had become a shockwave, shaping every battle since. January 1945. Germany's last stand. The airfields that once launched proud squadrons of FW-190s now held wrecks, charred skeletons of aircraft that never stood a chance. Fresh pilots arrived barely trained, thrown into cockpits and ordered to stop the unstoppable. In the skies above the fatherland, a final tragedy unfolded daily. Doris trying to climb were intercepted instantly. Roll evasions were anticipated and countered. Dive escapes failed as Mustangs matched or beat the speed. Every Luftwaffe trick was already written in Allied manuals. One German pilot screamed into his radio as a Mustang latched behind him. "How do they know every move? How?" No one answered, because everyone already knew. In a cramped bunker beneath Berlin, Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring slumped over a desk as reports flowed in like funeral notices. FW 190 losses, catastrophic experienced pilots, gone fuel, nearly zero factories, bombed into ruin. Hitler demanded miracles. He received silence. Göring whispered, defeated, "We lost the war the day we lost that airplane. Not destroyed, not shot down, not sabotaged, lost." To the enemy's runway. May 1945. Victory in Europe. Celebrations erupted across London, New York, and Paris. Pilots embraced on the tarmac, laughing and crying, aware that survival itself was a miracle. Captain Eric Brown walked through the quiet museum hangar where the captured FW 190 now rested. Polished, preserved, a monument to one of history's strangest turning points. He laid a hand on the cool metal. "You never meant to be here," he murmured. But fate had other plans. Reporters once asked Brown if the war in the air would have been different without that capture. He did not hesitate. "The FW 190 cost us dearly, but because we flew it, we learned how to beat it and everything that followed from it." Final reflections. War is often shaped by strategy, intelligence, manufacturing. But sometimes, it turns on the smallest choices. A compass error, a cloud bank, a field mistaken for friendly soil. Armin Faber didn't realize it then. But when his wheels touched down at RAF Pembrey on June 23, 1942, he had changed the war. He handed the Allies Germany's most lethal weapon, the secrets to defeating it, the blueprint for the fighters that would crush the Luftwaffe, and a priceless edge that saved thousands of Allied airmen. One moment of disorientation became one of history's greatest intelligence coups. The butcher bird, once feared beyond measure, became a stepping stone to victory. And